This week, just for the record, we are going to continue to deal with some broader concepts that will help you as you continue your Bible study, and particularly as you go throughout the Old Testament. It'll help you because it'll come back up, right? Again, some of the stuff that we talk about is going to be strange. At this point, that should not be a surprise to you. But that, again, remember, that is the focus of our study, is the things that make us pause and things that we skip over, right? And so to help you understand those ideas and concepts, so that as you see those things come back up, you kind of have an idea of what's going on, right? Next week, just for the record, we will kind of go back to, once we get into Exodus proper, we will go into more passages and we'll discuss some of the more important passages. Yahweh, in Exodus 3:14, and the whole personal name of God, and so we'll deal with some other things like that. But so this week I'm going to go over a few broader concepts. So the first concept that I wanted to go over is the idea of Sheol, and what they believed about Sheol in the Old Testament and the ancient world. Just for the record, Sheol is used 8 times in Job and 65 times in the Old Testament. So I wanted to give you kind of an idea of what Sheol is all about, because you'll see it and it'll come back up. And I want you to understand kind of how Sheol is used, how it's understood in the Old Testament, and then how that kind of goes toward the New Testament a little bit. So Sheol is generally associated with the underworld and death, right? And all ancient Near Eastern cultures and Egypt, they all had understandings of the underworld. So for instance, in Egyptian mythology, once you died, you went to the underworld, right? And then you went through all of these different tests to where you would have to pass each one to get to the final step, where you would then go to your afterlife. You're good, you're fine. Where you would then go to your afterlife. The last step that you had to follow is that you would stand before Osiris and he would weigh your heart against your deeds, right? And if your deeds were heavier than your heart, then that was good, and so you would go on to a positive afterlife, right? But if your heart was heavier than your deeds, then you went to a negative afterlife that was filled with torture and, well, things that you wouldn't want. If you've ever heard of people talk about the Egyptian Book of the Dead, it comes up oftentimes, particularly in like documentaries and stuff. So what is the Egyptian Book of the Dead? And as I look around this room, I do not see many of you who have ever played video games, okay? But, just for the record, this is going to be shocking that I played video games, right? Because you never expected that I was a nerd. All right, but just for the record, obviously that's a joke. I'm clearly a nerd. So back in the day, now it's all online, but you'd get a video game, right? And so video game, you'd have to go through all of these different trials and stuff, and you have to go through different bosses, that they call them, where you have to beat all these different bosses and stuff, right? Well, what you could do is you could go to Walmart and you could buy the guide, right, that would tell you how to go through all of these trials, and you could read, and you just read it, and I'm like playing, pause, play, pause, right? And I just go step by step because I like steps, right? So we're going step by step. You go through the guide. It tells you how to beat the game. There it is. That is exactly what the Egyptian Book of the Dead is, right? It is exactly that. It tells you how to get through each trial that you have to go through once you get to the underworld, so that you can then get to the end. There's ways to cheat the whole heart works deal, and you can get through, right? So that's what the Egyptians understood about about death and the underworld and the afterlife and all of that. In Mesopotamia, once a person died, he became a disembodied spirit in the underworld, right? So kind of a similar idea in the idea that you have an underworld, but you're a disembodied spirit. And it's described as dark, containing gates which prevented anyone from leaving, and all of that. So note that the Old Testament does not provide a clear understanding of the afterlife, right? like we talked about last week with progressive revelation, it's not until you get to the New Testament that you fill in some of those ideas. The idea of Sheol in the Old Testament largely follows the Mesopotamian beliefs concerning the afterlife. Sometimes in the Old Testament, it simply indicates the grave, but other times it clearly indicates something more. But again, it's certainly not a full-blown concept of what we get with heaven and hell and all of that in the New Testament. So for instance, in Job 26:5, right, we have Sheol located deep beneath the waters, where it says, and listen, I'm going to go through several of these verses. You're not going to be able to flip, or for me to pause and us go to these different verses. Don't worry about that, because we're basically going to do one at a time. And so if you'll just listen, I'll kind of go through them. But so in Job 26:5, it says, the dead tremble under the waters, right? And so again, and we talked about this in the first week, in the Old Testament time period and in the ancient world, they conceived of the world as a round disc, and underneath it was the underworld, right? You had the waters that we talked about last week, and we talked about chaos, and they believed, that it was chaos in the waters, because again, they didn't understand, right? They can't go into the waters deep and look like we can today with, all of our, Nat Geo shows and all that, and Planet Earth. And so they didn't know what all was there. Actually, that's not last week, that's this week. We're going to talk about that. And so you have all these waters there that are around all of the land. You have the underworld, which is Sheol, is underneath there. You have the dome above the top. You have the stars and the moon and stuff that go around in a circuit. There's windows in heaven that drops the waters out. And again, let me just point out, this is the way the ancient people understood. And so when God presents information to the ancient Israelites, he presents it to them in language that they understood. There's no reason to try to explain all of the things about, say, science or exactly how rain works or all of those things, because that's not the point. And it's like we said, I think the first week, if they're going to present science, then what decade of science would they present, right? Science today looks very different than science did 200 years ago. And science 200 years from today looks a lot different than what we understand about science today, right? So the Bible is written to certain people at a certain time in language that they understood with their concept in mind, right? So Sheol, under the waters in Job 26:5, or Deuteronomy 32:22, where it says, for a fire is kindled by my anger, and it burns to the depths of Sheol, devours the earth and its increase, and sets on fire the foundations of the mountains. So again, foundations of the mountains, you have deep within the earth, and Sheol is there underneath. And so that's where they conceived of Sheol. Its depth is sometimes contrasted with the height of heaven. So for instance, in Job 11:8, you have, it is higher than heaven, what can you do? Deeper than Sheol, what can you know? And so again, they conceived of, and you get that heaven is somewhere up there, right? So they understood heaven as up there, and so therefore Sheol is down there. Well, today, I don't think any of us understand heaven as up there. We think of it as another dimension, or however you want to look at it, but we don't think that we can get in a spaceship and we can fly to heaven, right? It is another dimension. Paul talks about powers and principalities, and he talks about the spirit world that is right here with us at the time that we're here, and it's working all around us, right? So it's more like that than it is we're going to get in a ship and be able to fly to it. And so again, in language that they understood. So they understood heaven is high, Sheol is low inside the earth. So clearly that depth indicates more than just the grave, right? They're not just dead in the grave. Those who are in the underworld are described as Raphaim, translated as shades or shadows of their former selves, as in Isaiah 14:9, where it says, Sheol beneath is stirred up to meet you when you come. It rouses the shades to greet you. all who were leaders of the earth. It raises from their thrones all who were kings of the nations. And so again, they conceived of the underworld as a place where people went, and then when you went there, there would be people there also. And however that works, again, it doesn't explain that. It doesn't go into any detail. Sheol is described as having gates so that no one can leave. So Isaiah 38:10 says, I said, in the middle of my days, I must depart. I am consigned to the gates of Sheol for the rest of my years, right? So again, described as gates. Job 38:17, have the gates of death been revealed to you, or have you seen the gates of deep darkness? Again, that whole idea of a place that you get to, but you can't come out of, Sheol, right? Sheol can also be personified. So Isaiah 5:14, it says, therefore Sheol has enlarged its appetite and opened its mouth beyond measure, and the nobility of Jerusalem and her multitude will go down, her revelers and he who exults in her. Again, that seems clearly to be figurative language, right, with the whole idea of its appetite. Hosea 13:14 says, I shall ransom them from the power of Sheol. I shall redeem them from death. O death, where are your plagues? O Sheol, where is your sting? Compassion is hidden from my eyes. And so again, in that case, I think you clearly have a figurative, where it's just thinking of Sheol as being able to open a mouth or things like that, I think obviously is figurative. But they clearly seem to understand the underworld as being a thing. Sheol is there. And it's a place that you go to. It's like a holding area, right? At this point, I do want to talk a little bit about original languages, right? Because some of this is going to we're going to talk about how the New Testament authors understood this whole idea of Sheol. And some of it, they kind of take forward, but then they add, things like heaven and hell to it. And we're really not going to go a lot into that. We're just going to talk about how the New Testament authors looked at Sheol. So, hey, how are you? Yeah, you're good. Come on in. All right. So let's imagine that Joe Turner wants to do the Joe Turner translation of the Old Testament, right? So how am I going to do that? Like, where am I going to go, right? So up until really 1947, or really in the 70s, honestly, if I wanted to translate the Old Testament, I had two options, all right? I could go to what's called the Masoretic Text, all right? The Masoretic Text, and pay attention, the most important things here are going to be the time period of the text and the language of the text. That's the two most important things, right? So the Masoretic Text, it is written by these guys that we call Masoretes. They're basically monks. And from about 800 AD until 1000 AD, they sat around and copied out the Old Testament, right? And so we call that copies that they have and that we've put together, we call it the Masoretic Text. Now, before the 1940s or even as late as the 70s, that was the best place that you could get original language documents for the Old Testament, because they're written in Hebrew and Aramaic, which is the language of the Old Testament. And so if I wanted to go back to the original languages, I had to look at the Masoretic Text, right? That's the text that I went to. As a quick side note, the other cool thing that they did for us is that we did not know how ancient Hebrew would be pronounced, right? And so what they did was they did this thing called vowel pointing, and anybody who's been to seminary, they've learned vowel pointing. And basically they would put, because in Hebrew, you only have the consonants, right? And so without the vowels, they could understand it because they knew the context. But if you just pick up the text and you learn Hebrew and you don't know what the vowels are, that would be a problem. So what the Masoretes did was they added these little dots and lines and such underneath to tell us what the vowels would have been. And so that's how we can now take modern Hebrew and we can look at that and we can figure out what the vowels were, right? It helps us to understand it today. Masoretic Text, written in Hebrew and Aramaic, the original languages, from about 800 to 1000 AD, right? So it's original languages, but it's late. Then we have what's called the Septuagint, okay? And I'm going to way oversimplify the Septuagint. But it is basically a Greek translation of the Old Testament from about 250 BC. So note it's early, right? But what's the problem with it? It's in Greek, right? It's not in the original languages, okay? So I would use the Septuagint as well, because I could say, okay, well, what did the people that lived 250 years before Jesus, how did they translate this into Greek, right? The cool thing about the Septuagint is that the Septuagint was the Bible of the New Testament authors, right? So when the New Testament authors quoted from the Old Testament, they did not use the original Hebrew and Aramaic. They used the Septuagint, which was the Greek translation. And you say, well, wait a minute. Why would they not have used the Hebrew and Aramaic? If you go back and you say, okay, Israelites used to speak Hebrew and write in Hebrew, right, early on. And then you get to the exile. They're exiled out into Assyria and Babylon. Well, the languages there were Aramaic, right? They spoke Aramaic. At that time, Aramaic was the language of the known world, right? And so the Israelites started speaking and writing in Aramaic, right? So by the time you get to Jesus, the language of the Hebrew people is not Hebrew, it's Aramaic. Now, when Jesus reads from the scroll in the synagogue, that would have been in Hebrew, right? They would have read that in the original Hebrew. But his language would have been Aramaic, and he would have also spoken Greek. Because in 332 BC, Alexander the Great came in, and he brought Greek culture to the known world, and that became the language of the world, right? And business and all of that, similar to how English is today. So you get to the New Testament period, the language of the Hebrew people is Aramaic, but they also spoke Greek. The Gentile language was Greek. And so therefore, when you have New Testament authors writing, what language is the New Testament in? Greek, right? And so when they quote from the Old Testament, they quote from Greek. And again, I'm not going to go into detail about it, but the reason we know that is because the constructions of the words and stuff and the way they translated things, we know that they had a Greek Bible, which was what we call the Old Testament. In 1947, the greatest archaeological discovery for the Bible is the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947. You have books of the Bible and also other books, but books of the Bible written in the original Hebrew and Aramaic that are discovered that are from 200 years before Christ up to the time of Christ, right? And so you have people sitting around during the time of Jesus copying out the Old Testament in its original languages, and we can go to those documents and we can look at those. That's really a lie. You can't do that because they're actually hidden in a back room, and they put facsimiles out that you can actually look at. They would not allow you to touch them. You would be tackled down and arrested. But that's spectacular. So today, you would use those three: the Masoretic Text, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Septuagint. Masoretic Text, late, but original languages. Septuagint, early, but a different language, Greek. And then the Dead Sea Scrolls, bam, bam, you've got early and original languages. So since the New Testament authors, they wrote in Greek and they read Greek, when they translated Sheol in the New Testament, or if they're in the Old Testament, the Septuagint, they use the word Hades, right? Somebody said that, I think somebody just said it. They use the word Hades, which is the Greek concept of the underworld, right? Now, one major difference between Hades and Sheol, again, there are times in the Old Testament where Sheol is personified, but we don't look at the Old Testament and say they believe that Sheol was a god or anything like that, right? Whereas in Greek mythology, clearly Hades is both a place and a god. There's no evidence that I know of to indicate that the New Testament authors believed that that Hades is obviously a real god. There's that they don't write that ever. It never happens. But they do have the same basic concept of an underworld, right? So what do these descriptions in the Old Testament tell us about the afterlife, right? Not much. Not much. They really don't tell us anything about the afterlife. Specifics, and why is that? Because specifics of the afterlife are just simply not a focus of the Old Testament. Does that mean that that it's made up in the New Testament or something? No, it's just not a focus. And so once we get to the New Testament, and you have Jesus, right, and you have salvation history worked out, you finally get to Jesus in the New Covenant. Well, at that point, that whole idea of what happens in the afterlife, those things then become more important, or not even important, but more on the minds of people. And so what does this whole Jesus thing mean for when I die? And so in the New Testament, it becomes a more important thing. And so that's why it's fleshed out in the New Testament, not in the Old Testament.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
When it talks about the patriarchs would die and go sleep with their fathers, is that
Yeah.
the same? Is that Sheol?
Yeah, so there's going to be different opinions depending on who you ask. But it in some cases, it does seem like that. But then others will say they're going to be with their fathers in what we would call in the New Testament heaven, but it just doesn't mention it that way, right? And so again, I would just say the Old Testament doesn't flesh that out, right? So they don't at least present an idea of heaven or hell or anything like that in the Old Testament. And it, again, because it's not a focus. But they certainly say go to be with their fathers and all of that. I personally would argue that they still have that concept of the underworld, and everybody does end up there, right? But there are other arguments, right? But I'm going to be honest with you, that's not one thing that I went through a whole bunch of. So
I kind of tend to think that they did have a concept of that, just simply because when Jesus used the illustration of Lazarus and rich man, that he's using the illustration that they would have understood, and he's saying, hey, he will go to Abraham's, basically to go be with Abraham, and then the rich man is going to, hell, or there's a chasm fixed.
Yeah.
So you mentioned going to sleep with their fathers.
Right.
I feel like if Jesus had not, he would have used that illustration to, unless he's just trying, like you said, unless he's trying to help define, to clarify some of that. Because then you have that whole idea of them being able to communicate back and forth and seeing, and so I don't disagree. Yeah. It's just I've always thought, well, maybe that's more of a parable to show you the finality of once you're in one place or the other, that's it. Because then you have to say, well, can they communicate at that point? Is there communication? And I would argue that no, that once you are there, but no, you're right. In Abraham's bosom, that's you're sleeping with the fathers.
Yes.
There's a sense of where
yes.
They understood that there's a difference between me going to be with Abraham,
right,
and there being a place of judgment,
right,
and
so. Right, and then you get the whole idea, was it in 2 Peter, where you have the harrowing of hell, right? Yeah. Where it says that Jesus went down into the underworld, right? And so at that point, it almost, to me, it's always seemed like there's a transition somehow of some concept of the Old Testament view of the underworld to now those people are somehow, however God does that, brings it into...
somewhere between the Old Testament.
That's exactly what I was saying.
When Jesus died, between his death and the resurrection, and he went down and did the sermon. In Matthew, it talks about the people coming back and walking amongst. Yeah.
And so that is an interesting passage, because then you have to look at that and say, well, is that some sort of resurrection, or like what exactly is happening there? And again, that's one of those things. I think that's part of the deal is, so what we're trying to do, or what I'm trying to do, is to basically put you in the mind of what they believed, right? And so in the Old Testament, with the information that they had, this is what they would have understood, right? So then even then, for us moderns, with our scientific minds, we want to be able to explain everything. And you just can't do that. There's just no way to do that. So that would be one of those passages where those people get up and walk around and stuff. I'm like, I don't know. Like, I don't know what that means. And what happened to those people afterwards? I don't know. And it doesn't say, like, exactly, did they then die again? Or, like, just kill over or whatever. It doesn't seem that they went up, because that would be, I think that would present a theological issue because the resurrection hasn't happened. So yeah, that's one of those passages I just say, well, when we get to the New Testament, I'll do a lot of research on that, and then I'll have some options for you.
In Mark, too, it said after his death, he went to the grave.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
Isn't it a theory that Sheol had kind of two parts, one for the old saints, the other one's for...
Yeah, there's a theory. Yeah, there's theories. Yeah, and that's the thing, is it's us trying to explain information that we don't have filled out, right? And so yeah, and exactly. And then where does Abraham's bosom and all that? Like, what exactly? Yeah.
So what you're talking about, though, it is great to understand.
Yeah.
Because in some ways, when Jesus is coming to fulfill the law, and he is giving us greater clarity.
Yes, absolutely.
Even in the law, in Sermon on the Mountain, you say, "Do not murder," and I say to you, this.
Yes.
So he's bringing greater clarity and greater understanding.
Exactly.
Which makes sense that he's bringing greater understanding.
Yes.
On hell, because there was some ambiguity in the Old Testament.
Yeah. Well, and what does that look like before Jesus, where you have to believe in Jesus, right?
They understood judgment. We think about hell as judgment.
Yes.
Now, under a Mosaic covenant, their sea judgment is what happened to Deuteronomy. It's like, if I'm under the judgment of God, I'm going to see it today.
Yes,
right now.
that's exactly right.
This is where
The Assyrians and the Babylonians are going to bring. Yes, that is exactly right. Yes, absolutely agree. It's funny because we probably went through all the rest of my notes in that discussion. Hey, let me just say, I appreciate the discussion because that's when the class gets fun. Let me just say, without going into any detail, and again, we're not in the New Testament, so I'm not going to go into any detail, but listen, when we talk about greater clarity in the New Testament, even then, like, we have a lot of concepts of heaven. A lot of them come from, Revelation, where it's highly symbolic. And even now, we don't have a full concept, right? Like, we expect that God owes us all the information, and we don't have all the information, right? And so, but we're like, well, we need to know, right? Inquiring minds want to know. But God doesn't owe us anything. We know what we need to know to do what we need to do, right? And that's the thing. And so even in the New Testament, the good Christian scholars disagree about what happens when you die exactly, right? People disagree about whether heaven is your ultimate state or the heavens and the earth come together and however. And again, those are things that we disagree on, again, based on not, heretical interpretations, but just there's not enough information to fully, grasp that. That's why I always say, when people get overly confident about some of those issues, and they're like, well, this is just the way it is. And then you say, well, what about this, that, and the other? There is some ambiguity, is a great word. And so I think we have to be careful. Now, if you say, well, I don't know, it seems like Jesus, maybe he didn't actually die on the cross because, well, at that point, there's no ambiguity in the New Testament about Jesus dying on the cross and those types of things, right? Where salvation comes from, there's no ambiguity. But some of the other details, particularly when we talk about, prophecy and stuff like that, we have to be very careful, right? And so as our discussion has, worked out, that is the thing, is there's just not enough information to get a full grasp of, all of that. All right, very good. So let me say this, though. I will just add this, and then we will move on past this. The closest we will come to an idea like we get in the New Testament, though, is from Daniel 12:2, where it says, and many of those who sleep in the dust, so again, it seems to be those who are dead, right, of the earth, shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And so note that Daniel is written a good bit later in that Old Testament time period. And so at that point, there seems to be opening up a greater understanding or a different idea about what happens after you die. And even then, you get an idea of what seems to be resurrection and then a eternal punishment and eternal positive afterlife, right? So you have that. All right, so we're going to talk about this whole conversation that we're going to do now is going to get us into this whole idea of Leviathan, right? And Behemoth to a smaller extent. We're not going to talk a lot about that, but we're going to kind of talk about that. You saw the movie? Yeah. Okay. All right, I did not see that movie, but all right. Throughout the ancient world, or the ancient Near East at least, water, particularly the oceans and the seas, are presented as chaos and personified by a great sea dragon, okay? Now, you think right now it sounds crazy, but I'm going to explain it and you're going to understand it. Creation narratives from the ancient Near East present the storm god of whatever people group, whether it's the Babylonians or whoever you're talking about, the storm god slaying the chaos dragon and establishing order out of disorder or chaos, right? And I know you're thinking that sounds crazy, but again, stay with me. So in the 3rd millennium BC, for instance, you have the Sumerian god Ninurtu defeats a serpent with 7 heads to rise to the head of the pantheon of the gods, right? So he becomes the head god. The city god of Eshnunna, also in Sumer, which is it's the most south, right there at the Persian Gulf, right in Iraq. It's right there at the Persian Gulf. With Sumer, it's, in all fairness, kind of on a side note, that is where the first cities were built, right? Was right there in Sumer. It's fairly spectacular. Eshnunna also defeats a sea dragon with 7 heads, right? Adad, another storm god, provides the king of Mari. His name is Zimri Lim, that king, which is a pretty fancy name, with the weapons to defeat the sea monster. And the Babylonian Enuma Elish, which is, we talked about that when we talked about some of the ways that the creation account in Genesis is different than the concept that people had in the ancient world. So Enuma Elish is one of the more important stories that we have from that period. It is the storm god Marduk who defeats the chaos dragon Tiamat and uses her corpse to create the heavens and the earth. And we talked about that before. In Ugarit, it is the storm god Baal. Baal should be familiar to you because Baal shows up a lot in the Old Testament, who defeats the sea serpent Yam, right? All right, now follow the thinking here. Yam is represented as the sea dragon Tunin, which is the Ugaritic word, which is related to the Hebrew word Tannin, which means dragon. Ugarit is north of Israel, and it is a close language. They're both Semitic languages, and Ugaritic is a language, they're related, and we have a huge trove of documents that they found there, right? Tablets. And so we can read all about the gods of those people. And that's the gods that the ancient Hebrews worshipped when they got in trouble, right? They're worshiping those gods. Those are the Canaanite gods. So note that Yam is also represented, this dragon, as the 7-headed sea creature Lotan, or Leton, depending on which the vowels are, related to the Hebrew word Leviathan, okay? This is the background for the biblical Leviathan that you read about in Job. And the use in the Bible shows that there is no chaos which is not under God's control. Okay, and we're going to go into kind of what all that means. Why do they have this belief in the first place? Why do they believe these things about water? Well, again, as modern scientific people who can send, drones, basically, whatever you want to call them, into the oceans and film all that spectacular, footage that we get on planet Earth or whatever, we know what's in the ocean. And some of that stuff is crazy, right? Well, in the ancient world, they couldn't dive and go deep and stuff, but they knew there was stuff there. And so that was, for us, the final frontier is space, right? For them, the final frontier, they didn't even consider space. The final frontier was the oceans and the waters and what was in the deep. And so that's what they understood. The water seemed unpredictable and chaotic, and there was no way to know exactly what was in there. All right, so Leviathan in Job 41. Note that the defeat of Leviathan is seen as both a past event, so you can look at Psalm 74:14, where it says, "You crushed the heads," plural, "of Leviathan. You gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness." Slaying Leviathan is also seen as a future event. So in Isaiah 27:1, you get, "In that day the Lord with his hard and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and he will slay the dragon that is in the sea." Note the descriptions here. Psalm 74:14 says, you crush the heads, plural, of Leviathan. And then Isaiah 27:1 says, in that day the Lord with his hard and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan the twisting serpent, and he will slay the dragon that is in the sea. So you have the following. You have described as several heads, right? And the fleeing serpent and the twisting serpent. All right. So remember when we talked about those texts in Ugarit that we can take and we can read, right? And if you read what's called the Baal cycle, which is the stories about Baal that would teach you what those Hebrew people believed about Baal when they were worshiping false gods, the description there of Lotan or Leviathan in Ugaritic, when you smite Lotan, the fleeing serpent, finish off the twisting serpent, the close coiling one with 7 heads, right? So note that they are both speaking of the same mythological creature that represents the ultimate and most terrifying monster being held in check by an all-powerful God. Note that Satan, as the poster child for chaos in the New Testament, is represented in Revelation as a dragon with 7 heads. Revelation 12:3, and another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads 7 diadems, which are crowns. So that presents the slaying of Satan as the ultimate fulfillment of Isaiah 27:1. In that day, the Lord with his hard and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and he will slay the dragon that is in the sea. The whole idea there is as Satan is the ultimate of chaos, he will be eventually defeated by God. And so he just happens to represent. Why would you do that? What you say, well, wait a minute. So are you saying that God is saying that there's no? I'm saying that God is presenting information to those people in the Old Testament the way that they would have understood it. They believed that to be the case. And the ultimate chaos to them was the sea embodied in a dragon. God does not try to explain it to them. He just says, no, I can defeat that. It's not a equal power to me. It is a created being. Everything is created, and I have complete control over that, right? And you still say, I don't know, that seems weird. Well, it's the same thing that you talk about, and there was a little kid in my Sunday school class the other day, and they laughed at me because I was like, well, there's not a dragon under, or there's not a boogeyman under your bed, right? But have you ever told your kids that you could defeat the boogeyman, right? Sometimes you just come out and say, listen, there's no boogeyman, right? But then sometimes you break down and just say, listen, Dad can defeat the boogeyman, right? I'll get the boogeyman out of here. You use language like that because they believe that there's a boogeyman. And if you explain it in such a way that, listen, logically, there's no boogeyman, I can't lie. And so I told that kid, I said, well, there's no boogeyman. And then I was like, well, I mean, there's no boogeyman under your bed. And then they all laughed at me because I'm thinking in my mind, like my logical mind, I'm thinking, well, technically, I mean, there's bad people, they're boogeyman, but whatever. All right, so then they just laughed at me and they were like, just stop talking. And I'm like, I'm so sorry. I'm just trying to be logical. So some interpreters have clearly struggled with this idea of Leviathan as a mythological creature. So for instance, the Life Application Study Bible, which I grew up on, the notes at 41:1, it says, while Leviathan usually refers to a 7-headed sea monster in old Canaanite myths, yeah, it probably means crocodile here. It's like, wait, what? Right? And then it goes on to say, it is foolish for people to think they can stand up against God when they are afraid to confront a crocodile. How much more powerful is God? Well, God is more powerful than a crocodile. Impressive, right? I'm like, I don't know that's what that means. Notice that the problem here, which should seem fairly logical, they hunted crocodiles in the ancient world, right? And it wasn't that difficult. Egyptians actually trained them and adorned them with jewels and necklaces and all kinds of stuff, and then they worshiped them as sacred. The ancients also hunted lions, which were fairly spectacular, and that would be fairly scary. So Job 41 makes a big deal out of how only God can tame Leviathan. But crocodiles were already hunted and tamed by humans, right? So the description is way beyond any animal we could imagine, or that they could imagine, which is kind of the point. That's the thing. The most terrifying thing that you could ever imagine, God even has his foot on that. There's no equal power to God that is going to create any issue for him, right? So you can trust in God because there's nothing here. You believe in all this chaos and stuff, but God has this in control. As moderns, we may look at it as hard times, right? We look at, whatever terrible thing that's happening, whether it be disease or whatever, and then we put our faith in God and we say, well, God can handle this one way or the other, however it works out. Well, for them, a powerful God, which they believe, most of them believe it in multiple gods, a powerful God could defeat chaos. Chaos is embodied in a sea creature, and God says, okay, I can defeat that chaos. All right, I'm good with that. All right. Notice too, besides having many heads, note the description of Leviathan at Job 41, 18 through 21. It says, his sneezings flash forth light, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the dawn. Out of his mouth go flaming torches, sparks of fire leap forth. Out of his nostrils comes forth smoke, as from a boiling pot and burning rushes. His breath kindles coals, and a flame comes forth from his mouth, right? So either he has really bad breath, or he breathes fire, right? And so again, that description goes a little further than a creature that we can put our finger on. Note that and this is the last thing that I'll say about it. The NIV Bible Speaks Today notes, which comes from a larger commentary set, and I actually looked at both of those, and they have the same information. They have it exactly right, but you see that they have a problem with, again, completely going to these are potentially mythological creatures. It says on the notes on chapters 40 and 41, it says, now Behemoth, the hippo, right, and Leviathan, the crocodile, raise the question of God's power. God selects two of the creatures which are most feared. These monstrous animals may perhaps be meant here as descriptions of real creatures, or perhaps as a sort of fantasy picture of creatures out of fable. Behemoth is the plural of the regular Hebrew word for a beast, or collectively for cattle. So this might mean that Behemoth is the beast par excellence, exactly, right? The Leviathan seems like, or rather like, a dragon with flaming breath and smoke from his nostrils. He appears also in Isaiah 27 as a beast of supernatural terror. Taken together then, Behemoth and Leviathan embody the inexplicable and the frightening in God's world. There is a great deal about these two strange creatures which Job does not know and cannot control. But there is reassurance. Even the most fearful and monstrous and powerfully terrible things are held within the Creator's hand. Everything under heaven belongs to me. So again, in the eyes of those ancient Israelites, that's the point, right? That God can conquer this chaos. We're not afraid of the oceans. They were terrified of it, and they believed that could overcome, right? They believe obviously there's floods and things, and that terrified them. And so that's the way God eased them, is by explaining that. And I won't go into a lot of detail, but Behemoth, since they're right there together, it's the same idea. All right, so we did that. Again, Job shows that not only does Yahweh control these creatures, but he created them in the first place, so they do not equal Yahweh in power. We talked about that. We did the boogeyman thing. Yahweh's in control, right? So again, what's the deal about Job, right? At the end of Job. And then we're going to do a little bit about Exodus just because we've got a lot to do next week. If we can conclude from all of this that God is powerful, and all-wise, because Job cannot prove God's justice, right, by this. Because again, we don't have enough information. We're only here for a short time. And so things seem bad at times, right? We don't have the long view. However, what we can prove is God's all-powerfulness and his wisdom. And so again, if we can conclude from all of this that God is all-powerful and all-wise, then we must conclude that he is also just. indirectly answering Job's question, because Job does not get a direct answer to his question. But he does get an answer that shows him how wise and powerful God is. And if God is that wise and that powerful, then therefore he must be just. And that's where you end up in Job concerning the justice of God. It's not that it can be proven to us because we're here for too short a time to know. We can't know the ramifications of the things that may be going on right now in the near future, the farther distant future. We can't see all of that. But God can, and as he is all wise and all powerful, we can assume that he is all just. Now, looking toward Exodus, we're going to go over one basic idea that that will help you. We've kind of talked about some of this in the past. So, plagues, right? You've got your plagues. Now, is it possible that the plagues are natural phenomena? Well, if you watch the Discovery Channel, then yes. And they come up with this, they have an episode about the Exodus, and you go, basically, the Nile turned to blood. You've got mud that comes from some mountain. The mud comes in, and then you got, then the fish die, and then the frogs jump out to get out, and then the flies come in and eat the fish, and all of these different things, all the way to the parting of the sea, where if you create a strong wind that comes in, you can part. Okay. Is it possible that God used natural phenomena in initiating the plagues? Absolutely. If God chooses to do that, God can absolutely do that. But that completely misses the point, right? The plagues are presented as miraculous events, okay? Miracles are by their very nature outside of our natural expectations, right? So again, remember when we talked about one of the contrasts between what the ancients believed about creation and all of that, and what the Bible teaches is that God is not part of the creative order. All of the pagan gods are created by some other god at some point in time. They're part of the created order. The Genesis account does not teach that. It teaches that God created everything and he is outside of his creation, right? Now he can enter into his creation, and that's when we have miracles, right? When God reaches in and does something special in the creative order, that is by its very nature outside of testable science, right? Because it's a miracle. Again, it doesn't work by the natural workings of the world. It is a special, it's a special deal. Again, if God wants to perform miracles with natural phenomena, he can do that, but I certainly don't think that that's what the plagues are trying to tell us. So what is the point of the plagues? Well, the plagues would have been seen as Yahweh defeating the gods of Egypt, okay? So Exodus 12:12 says, "For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord." And notice it says, I am Yahweh, right? Because remember, the Lord in all caps, is the proper name of God, Yahweh, right? It says, I will execute judgments. I am Yahweh. Numbers 33:4 says, while the Egyptians were burying all their firstborn, whom the Lord had struck down among them, on their gods also the Lord executed judgments. An ancient person would have viewed this clearly as a battle between the gods. So again, and we talked about this a little bit before, so in the ancient world, every city had a god, right? So again, this is that whole idea of God helping out his people in language that they would have understood, okay? So they believed that there were Egyptian gods. Note that there had been 400-year silence from Yahweh. And so he shows back up. He has to explain his name and all of these different things. So he has to show that he is more powerful than what they believe are gods of Egypt, because that was a big deal in the ancient world. Every city had its own god or gods. Well, they all had their own gods, except for Israel, who had Yahweh, the God of Israel, right? The one true God. And so, again, we're in Morris, and there's a god in Kimberly, and there's a god in Warrior, there's a god of Gardendale. If I want to travel, right, I'm going to sacrifice to the god of Morris. I'm going to go to Gardendale. I'm going to sacrifice to the god of Gardendale if that's where I'm going. I'm going to sacrifice to every god from here to there, right? Wherever I'm going. Because I believe in the ancient world that all these gods exist. And so I'll take as much as I can get, right? The Israelites were to understand that there's only one God. Or at the very least, and this comes throughout, worship Yahweh above the other gods. Because there's many times where it's like, listen, if I could just get you to worship me exclusively, even if you think these other gods are real, I'll take it. But clearly throughout the Old Testament, the Hebrews worshipped other gods. That's why they're exiled, right? So they clearly believe that other gods exist. So battles in the ancient world. So let's say that I'm going to go into battle. We're going to go as Morris. We're going to go into battle against Gardendale. Okay, well, we're all going to go fight. But ultimately, it's not us fighting. It's the god of Gardendale versus the god or the gods of Morris. They're the ones actually doing the fighting, right? They're going to determine. That's why you have a crazy thing like David going and saying, Goliath coming out and said, send me your champion. And David saying, I'll go defeat him, and it's going to be by the power of God. And Saul saying, okay. Because when they come out, it's called Contest of Champions. Whether these two people fight or whether our whole armies fight, the gods are still going to decide who wins this battle. And so when David fights Goliath and he defeats Goliath and he says, it's by the power of God that I do this, that's what it is, right? And so that's the understanding that they had. And so that's why you have that. You have it in Greek mythology, you have Contest of Champions and all of that. The gods of Egypt should be able to protect their homeland. And so that's where the Israelites are. They have to be convinced to leave. And so one way we're going to do that is we're going to convince the Israelites that their God, or show the Israelites that their God is more powerful than anything they're afraid of over in Egypt, which would be the gods of Egypt and Pharaoh as a god. Pharaoh himself, who is a god. They needed to see that the God they were going to follow was more powerful than the gods that they were leaving. So each of the plagues is an assault upon the gods of Egypt in some way, culminating in the blotting out of the sun god Ra and killing the firstborn son of Pharaoh, who was a god himself and the figurehead of Egypt, the one who will not let them go. Examples. The Nile turned to blood would be an assault against Noom, the guardian of the Nile, and Hapi, the spirit of the Nile, right? You would think that Hapi would be associated with the frogs. But that's actually Hecate, all right, who had the form of a frog, the god of resurrection. The cattle, right, you have the plague on the cattle, which would be an assault against Hathor, the mother goddess, who had the form of a cow. Or Apis, the bull of Ta. Ta is a god, he has a bull, and it symbolizes fertility. So again, they can't take care of their livestock. Boils on the skin would have been an attack against Imhotep, who is the god of medicine. Hail and locusts would have been an assault against Isis, the goddess of life, or Set, protector of crops. Darkness would have again been, we always say Ra, the sun god in Egypt, but they actually had several sun gods. But it would have been a assault against the sun gods. And then the death of the firstborn would be a direct assault against Pharaoh and his son, right? And so we attack all the way to Pharaoh and kill the firstborn of Pharaoh. He can't protect his own son. Or Osiris, the giver of life. And so if Yahweh can take the life of the Pharaoh, who is a god, and Osiris cannot protect that life, then that would have been a powerful statement. This gave them the faith to leave, right? So, because again, we think it's ridiculous, and we laugh, and we laugh about different things, and we think, well, how foolish could they be? That's all they knew, right? That's the world that they lived in. And so it would be like if somebody else, let's say that a Mormon came to you and said, hey, you know what? You can pray for the dead and do all these things, and they can get to the higher levels of the celestial kingdom. And hey, once you do the right things and you do this, that, and the other thing, you get the ultimate prize. You can be the god of your own planet, right? You say, well, that sounds crazy. Well, if you grew up in that, it doesn't sound so crazy, right? And we say, well, no, we believe what we believe, right? Well, That's the way they understood. They understood all these gods. And again, the Old Testament presents information to them. God presents information to them in language that they understand. And so that's the point. And again, that's kind of our whole point here, is to provide the context so that you can think like an ancient Israelite. So that when you read this stuff and you come across it, you automatically think, oh, because they believed that there was a God there, and whatever happens. That's what I want you to understand. You can read the Bible, you can understand the basic stuff that you've always learned in Sunday school and all that, but this is the stuff that we skip over and we just say, shake our heads and say, I don't understand what this means. But to an ancient Israelite, all this stuff would have made complete sense. Like they would have been saying, yeah, you're right. All right. It's just the way it is. All right. All right. I mean, I like to think that at least, I like to think you all think I'm right too, but I'm not foolish enough to really believe that. All right. Very good. Any questions or concerns?
Okay.
Okay.
In the Exodus, the first few plagues, and the Egyptians, their magicians
Bless you
actually
twice.
copied, like the snake, the staff.
Yes.
Do you think that was a product of
Tricks
demonics
or
tricks?
Yeah, so there's different beliefs on that again. So certainly you can even see in India today where they can make a snake, they can make that snake go solid, right? And you could pick up a snake and you could do stuff like that, right? You can train a snake to do different things. Certainly again, and this goes into way deeper detail than we want to go, there are some who will argue things like, and Paul even says it in the New Testament, he says, you're not worshiping God, you're worshiping demons, right? So again, this is one of those things that it doesn't go into detail. I generally would think tricks of some sorts, but there are some who believe that it is by the power of demons. I don't generally give that type of power to demons because they don't have those, creative powers and things like that. I think sometimes we give Satan and demons too much power. But there are arguments to be made on both sides, right? And again, I wouldn't be dogmatic. It could certainly be by some, power. There's people today that do witchcraft, and whatever. And so if you're able to actually do something and move something with your mind or whatever, then we would argue that is certainly by the power of demonic spirits or something. However that works, my mind generally goes to they're able to perform tricks. And then obviously...
it wasn't just a stick, though. They mimicked a couple of them, right? The frogs.
Correct, but most of it's like the blood and the water and things like that, but it's not on the same scale, right? So the crazy thing about the blood in the Nile that we may not think about, we may skip over, is it's not just the blood in the seas and stuff. Even water in containers turns to blood. So like I've got a glass of water sitting next to my bed, the Warrior River turns to blood, and so does that glass of water sitting next to my bed, right? So that is a clear supernatural event that would be hard to do. But I don't think, if I'm not mistaken, I don't think that the Egyptian magicians and stuff, I don't think theirs is anywhere near that scale on that one, and certainly not for the others.
Yeah, but they did say that they were able to duplicate that.
That is
So
correct.
where did they get the water that wasn't already blood? And,
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the big trick, you said it was tricks. The trick would have been if they could have turned it back.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and again, not to get into. Yeah, well, then somebody else was asking in my class, they were saying, well, okay, we have all these cows, and then the cows are killed or whatever, and then where do the new cows come from, and all of that, and it's like, okay, well, you might expect there's some time or something going on there, some distance in time or whatever, so, yeah. Again, we want to look at every detail, and I do, I do too, but there's not enough information to present. The point is the miraculous events and the power of God over the power of whatever Pharaoh has to offer or Egypt has to offer. But yeah, it would be nice to know all of these details and be able to explain. All right, very good. Does somebody else have a question real quick?
I do, but it's just a clarification I'm asking for. So, again, in this big context that you're talking about, I've always looked at it like he is seriously trying to get Pharaoh to let them go, and every time, over and over again, he tells him,
Yes.
go tell him this is going to happen.
Yes.
But he's not going to do it.
Right.
Go tell him this is going to happen.
It says that he
But he's
hardened
not gonna do it.
Pharaoh's heart. And then it says Pharaoh hardened his own heart.
But
Yes.
now, something you said makes that such a part of God's plan that he knew it.
Mm-hmm.
Job may not have understood, or not Job, but didn't understand it, but
Bless
he
you.
understood that we're not going to suddenly leave.
Yes.
When they're not for Pharaoh, they're for the Israelites to say,
Yes,
this
agreed.
is my God better than
Yes.
all the other gods. I have to go.
Yes. If they had left, or if it then the first one, he said, "Yep, you can go." Maybe they didn't have enough faith at that point.
But
Yes.
they wanted to anyway.
It's a faith building exercise. I absolutely agree that could be part of it.
I never had that light bulb.
Yeah. And we'll talk about, just for the record, we'll talk about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart and all of that next week. Thanks for watching, and please feel free to leave a comment or question. And if you found this video helpful, hit like. And if you would like to be notified when new videos are released, hit subscribe and join us next time as we study the Bible in context.